Welcome to week 3 of the course on global civics. This week we'll be talking about international trade. For most of human history, it was the movement of goods rather than movement of people or movement of ideas that integrated the world. For much of our history, ours was an agricultural civilization, so the things we were trading were essentially agricultural crops. For example, rice and wheat moved from different corners of Eurasia. Or we saw how potatoes and quinine left South America and came to Europe and basically transformed Europe, because potatoes meant that there was increased vitamin C intake, therefore better health in Northern Europe, and quinine meant that we had an anti-malarial drug for south of Europe, where malaria was a big problem. These days, with the further integration of the world and standardization allowed by things like container shipment, international trade is an ever-growing part of our reality. Our lecturer this week is Professor Mohammed Razeen from the National University of Singapore, and he will give us an account of the history and the current state of international trade.
Trade is more important than ever before in world history. It connects us as never before. It is one of the centripetal forces in the world economy today. It is, if you will, the fulcrum of 21st century economic globalization. Yet trade has origins that date back several millennia, and one can point to periods of history, both ancient history and recent history, when intensive trade has connected regions and indeed the global economy as a whole. So it's not unprecedented. Another point to make initially is that trade can't be seen in economic isolation, as it were. It's inextricably wound up with politics, with culture, with society. Trade is very much a part of domestic politics. Interest groups haggle over what they perceive to be the costs and the gains from this or that trade policy, whether it's opening to the world economy or closing off from the world economy. And trade is also very much a part of international politics. It's very much part of the big international relations questions of war and peace, wealth and poverty. So for that reason, the governance of international trade is indeed a vital issue. Now in this talk, I'm going to address 3 key issues concerning international trade. The first, I'll do a brief review of the history of international trade. Secondly, I'll address the age-old debate of free trade versus protection. And thirdly, I'll look at the international governance of trade and really look at how it's changed over the ages, what's the state of play, and what the debits and the credits are. So let me start with the first big theme, and that's the history of international trade. As I said in my little introduction, trade is not new. Its origins go back to about 3000 BC to Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq. And one can point at various points in ancient history to periods when trade has flourished, especially during empires that have covered vast land masses and that have also been relatively stable. So trade did indeed flourish during the Roman Empire, during the Maurya Empire in India, during the Sung dynasty in China, for example. But from past history, I'm going to give you 2 big examples of how trade flourished. One concerning overland trade, the other concerning trade overseas. The overland example I have is of the Silk Route, which connected China across the Eurasian steppe to the Mediterranean and indeed Western Europe beyond that. And the second example I have in mind is Indian Ocean trade. Let's take the Silk Route. The Silk Route, which transported silk, notably, from China to the Mediterranean and Europe, and the other way, horses and other luxury goods for the Chinese traveled. The Silk Route had its first flowering during the Han Dynasty in China and the Roman Empire in Europe, and its last flowering was during the Mongol rule, the Pax Mongolica as it was known, from the mid 13th century to the mid 14th century. That was the period when Marco Polo traveled to China. That's one example. Another example is Indian Ocean trade. Now that started with Arab traders who discovered and then rode the monsoon winds from the Middle East and Africa all the way to the coastlines of India, to Southeast Asia, and all the way around to the coastal ports of China. Sinbad the Sailor, for example, in the tales of the 1000 and of the Arabian Nights, Sinbad the Sailor was a trader, and he plied this route all the way from Baghdad to the Chinese coastal port of Canton, and he brought back with him textiles from India, as well as porcelain from China. So, trade is not new. I've just given you a couple of examples. The examples I've given you so far have been of benign trade, as it were. But trade in some periods of history has been less benign. And the period I have in mind in particular is the age of mercantilism, roughly from the 16th to the 18th centuries. That was when European conquistadors, starting with the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then later the Dutch and the British, muscled in to trading networks in other parts of the world. I'm thinking of Asia in particular. And they muscled in with violence, and they conquered seas and then conquered land masses, and effectively monopolized trade. Now, that created winners, for example, the East India Company of the Dutch and the East India Company of the British, but it created lots of losers as well. The next big stage in international trade comes with the Industrial Revolution. The first Industrial Revolution, which started in Britain in the last third of the 18th century, and then successive industrial revolutions through the 19th century and the 20th century. And we saw new technologies coming into being, effectively replacing manpower and horsepower with machines, steam, and then later in the 19th century, the railways, the submarine cable, the telegraph, and then in the 20th century, cars, aeroplanes, containerization of shipping, and more recently, of course, satellites, computers, and the internet. Now, all of those new technologies gave a huge boost to international trade, but it couldn't have happened without the interaction of technology, Prometheus unbound as it were, on the one hand, with the opening of markets through more liberal trade policies on the other hand. And the first big opening in the modern era, we can date back to the first half of the 19th century, led by the British. They removed a lot of the severe restrictions on trade that were put in place by the age of mercantilism, during the age of mercantilism. And that unleashed 19th century globalization, as it were, which was, up until that time, the biggest economic globalization the world had ever seen. And what that period of globalization saw was a massive increase in international trade, with the mass production and export of industrial goods, as well as the mass production and export, for the first time, of agricultural produce and raw materials. Now that period came crashing to a halt with the outbreak of World War I, and then with severe government intervention and protectionism during the interwar years, the 1920s and the 1930s, and then also World War II. After that, from 1945, we saw, and we're still seeing, the period of re-globalization, as it were, an attempt to put the liberal international economic order back together again. And this happened under the leadership of the United States in those early years in two phases. In the first phase, roughly from 1945 to 1980, we saw the countries of the West, North America, Western Europe, and then Japan, liberalize their markets, open trade to each other and to other parts of the world. And then in the second phase, from 1980 until the present, and this is the biggest, most intensive period of economic globalization the world has ever seen. In the second phase, we see developing countries that were previously closed off from the world economy, as well as the ex-Soviet, the ex-communist bloc, open up and integrate into the world economy. And that includes, of course, China, Russia, Brazil, India, Indonesia. And what we have today is trade that's flourished as never before. Just to give you a few facts and figures. World trade has increased by about 7% a year on average over the last 60 years or so. And that's almost twice the rate of world growth. Now that shows us that trade is one key factor in powering world growth, world GDP. Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner, two economists from the United States, tell us that going back to 1980, about 30% of the world's population lived in fairly open economies. Now it's 90% plus. World trade accounts for about 20% plus of world GDP today. 100 years ago it was 5%. In 1973 it was 10%. So that gives you an indication of how much trade has grown over the last few decades. Now, trade has changed over different periods, and over the last 20 or 30 years, it's also changed enormously. So let me wind up this review of the history of international trade with 5 key ways in which international trade has changed just in the last 2 or 3 decades. Firstly, manufacturing. It's trade in industrial products that now dominates world trade. It's about 2/3 of merchandise trade. And that includes now huge and increasing exports from a whole range of developing countries. And that has fueled their industrial revolutions. Secondly, trade in services. Now before, a lot of services activities like banking, telecommunication services, all sorts of professional services like management consultancy, even education. These were not traded across borders. Now they are. And that's one big motor in the world economy. Thirdly, multinational corporations. It's estimated that multinational corporations and their satellite networks account for up to about 2/3 of international trade. So that's a key feature of the modern world economy. Fourthly, related to all the other points I've mentioned, is the emergence of what are called global supply chains. Now, if we go back even just a few decades, trade was very much about things produced in one country from start to finish being exported to other countries. Now, in whole swathes of the world economy, particularly in ICT products, but in other areas as well, in manufacturing and in services, we see the production process effectively splintered so that different parts of the value chain are located in different countries, and they're united in the logistics networks, often of multinationals and their suppliers. And then everything comes together to serve the world market. The iPhone, the iPod, the iPad are classic examples of how this happens with, for example, the research and design and logistics being coordinated in California. Some of the software comes from India. A lot of the components come from different countries in East Asia, and it's all assembled in China to cater to the world market. So that phenomenon of global supply chains, which involve manufacturing, services, multinationals, is one of the key drivers now of international trade, of productivity, of employment and growth. The fifth and final novel phenomenon in international trade is very much the emergence of emerging markets. Developing countries now account for about 45% of international trade. It was 30% 3 decades ago. And we see the emergence of new players, particularly China. China accounted for just 1% of world trade in 1980. Now it's 10%. It's the leading exporter of manufacturing goods in the world. So there we have a quick overview of the history of international trade from ancient times to the present. Let me switch now to my second big theme, which is about the debate between free trade and protection. Now, this is an age-old debate. It's nothing new. It's almost as old as the history of international trade itself. Let me start with some of the main protectionist arguments before I come to the free trade side of the ledger. Now, protectionist arguments date back at least to Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greece, but modern arguments for protection, the type you see on television and in your newspapers today, date back to the Mercantilist era of the 16th and 17th centuries, roughly. So what are those main arguments? They're the following. One, you need to restrict imports in order to have a trade surplus. In other words, an excess of exports over imports, because that's considered one of the key indicators of national wealth. Two, the so-called infant industry argument. You need to protect and nurture your domestic enterprises, particularly industrial enterprises, because that's one of the key ways of industrializing the economy and growing and creating wealth. Thirdly, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. One nation's gain is another nation's loss. So it's important for your nation to engage in protectionism in order to gain a bigger slice of the international economic pie, as it were, at the expense of everybody else. Another argument, you need protectionism in order to preserve social stability, because free trade upsets that. You need protectionism to protect employment, because free trade upsets that as well. Free trade, so some argue, is also bad for the environment. It creates greater inequality, and so on. And so one needs an element of protectionism in order to prevent all those bad things from happening. There's the national security argument. You need protectionism in order to defend the sovereignty of your territory. There's an argument of economic security as well. Some argue that you need protection in order to ensure that a critical mass of your food is actually produced and supplied at home. And there are other arguments besides. Now, let me state this up front. All these arguments, almost all the time, are wrong. They're wrong in theory, and they're wrong in practice. It's what Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate in economics, calls pop internationalism. It's what another economist I know calls DIYE, do-it-yourself economics. So why are these arguments wrong? If not all the time, then almost all the time. That brings me to the free trade side of the ledger. Now, the basic economic argument for free trade revolves around the notion of what economists call comparative advantage. And to put it in its simplest terms, comparative advantage is about a nation, a country, specializing, producing and exporting what it can make that is cheaper comparative to other countries. So that's what it should do, and everything else it should import from other countries. So where it doesn't have that cost advantage, then it should import goods and services from other countries that can do it better. And what that brings about are the so-called gains from trade. So by specializing in a mutually advantageous international division of labor, countries gain in the sense that production is more efficient and the consumer gets a better deal, a far better deal, than he or she would do if there were protection against imports. Now that's the basic argument, but there are additional arguments, also very powerful ones, in favor of open markets and free trade. And these are much more to do about the gains from trade, not in one moment in time, but over a period of time, the so-called dynamic gains from trade. It's the movie of trade, if you like, as opposed to a snapshot. So what are these arguments? Well, one is about technology. Open markets allow countries to learn from what's happening abroad, to scan the environment and import and absorb superior technology in order to make their own economies more competitive. Open markets also are much better at attracting foreign investment from multinationals. And multinationals bring in not only their capital, but also their skills, their technology, their management expertise, and of course their contact networks all over the world. Open markets enable domestic companies to hitch on to multinational enterprises, and also by other means improve their competitiveness by being competitive not just on the domestic stage, but the world stage. They allow countries to enter and then flourish in global supply chains. And that's very important for domestic enterprises, not just multinationals, because it gives them access, among other things, to world-class imports, which they use as inputs for their exports all over the world. Basically, open markets, free trade, allow firms to improve their productivity, to reap economies of scale, and to be generally much more competitive. And that feeds into jobs, into overall growth, and into a better deal for the consumer. One final argument for open markets. International competition provides a much greater variety of goods and services at lower cost for consumers all over the world. Now, those are the arguments in the abstract for free trade, but in practice, they have been borne out, not least during that great globalization in the 19th century, and then again during these two phases of re-globalization post-War II that I talked about a few moments earlier, in all kinds of ways. International trade and the static and the dynamic benefits it's brought about was critical to the recovery and growth of the Western economies after World War II, and continues to this day. It's also been critical to the growth of countries like China and India and Brazil and other emerging markets in the last few decades. Opening to trade has been very much part of their mix of industrializing and growing much faster than they otherwise would have done. And higher growth with higher living standards has provided the basis for big reductions in poverty and other improvements in human welfare. The World Bank in the 1990s did a big study of emerging markets and their trade, and it came to the conclusion that the countries that had actually opened up more to the world economy grew 5 times faster than countries that remain closed. So the evidence that opening and openness to trade feeds into higher rates of growth, higher productivity, and the overall welfare of countries is overwhelming. Now, so far I've given you the main economic arguments in favor of free trade and against protection, And these arguments are very much about increasing or maximizing, as Adam Smith put it, the wealth of the nation. But we shouldn't look at free trade in simply that economic context. I'd like to put it in a much broader context. And I see free trade very much as a trinity. There's the economic argument, which I've just given you, but there's also an international political or a geopolitical argument, as well as a moral argument. The geopolitical argument is this, and this is, if anything, the oldest argument in favor of free trade. It's the connection between free trade and international peace, or the global pax. And the argument is along the following lines. Commercial contact and connections among nations is one of the biggest insurance policies we have to prevent war taking place. By increasing these commercial contacts, we create the stakes, we create the familiarity that diffuses international political tensions and conflict that sometimes leads to war. It's no absolute guarantee, but it's, as I said, one of the big insurance policies that preserve peaceful international relations. And peaceful international relations, the other way around, are also indispensable for flourishing international commerce. There's a quote from a French thinker from the 19th century, Frédéric Bastiat, who said that if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. The final aspect of the Trinity is very much a moral argument, and that's an argument in favor of economic freedom. Now, the case for free trade is very much part of the case for free markets overall, which is in turn very much entwined with the case for economic freedom. In Adam Smith's language, you're free to pursue your own interest, your own way, upon the liberal plan of liberty, equality, and justice, as he put it. And what he meant by that was that individuals should be as free as possible from government restrictions to do as they please, particularly in their economic daily lives. Now that applies as much beyond borders in international trade as it does within the border in terms of domestic trade. And that freedom allows individuals to be creative and to build up the bourgeois virtues of thrift, of hard work, of enterprise, and of responsibility. And it's part of a flourishing commercial society. That's the way that they can maximize their life chances, make the most of their lives, as it were. So, free trade, I think, is that trinity. There's an economic argument, there's an international political argument, and there's a moral argument as well. Let me now come to my third and final theme for this lecture, and that concerns the governance of international trade. And I want to start at the national level, at home, as it were. Now, the fact is that the overwhelming number of trade measures, whether it's in favor of free trade or it goes in the opposite direction, they're conducted by national governments, and it's what national governments do on import tariffs, quotas, trade-related standards, and all sorts of other trade instruments that have the most bearing on whether a country is open or less open to the world economy. But as we know from history, national action is sometimes not enough, and in some cases, nations, governments can clash with each other and create bad effects for the world, what economists know as externalities. And that sets up the logic and the necessity for some degree of international cooperation. International trade reinforces that point if one takes a cursory look at its history. There have been times when nations and empires clashing with each other have led to the destruction of trade orders. That happened, for example, with the disintegration of the Mongol Empire in the mid-13th century. It happened more recently, just a century ago, when the outbreak of World War II effectively smashed the 19th century globalization I talked about. And then if we look at the interwar period of the last century, between the two world wars and with that middle period of the 20s and 30s, the lack of international cooperation, among other factors, certainly contributed to governments engaging in tit-for-tat protectionism that escalated out of control, that exacerbated, that worsened the effects of the Great Depression, and that created fertile ground for World War II. So the lesson learned by the founding fathers of the international economic system post-World War II, and these were mainly Americans, as I said before, the lesson learned was that international cooperation was necessary. First, to create a global pax, peaceful international relations, and secondly, to put back together again a liberal international economic order, including relatively free international trade. So that leads me to multilateral cooperation in international trade as it has evolved from 1945 or thereabouts to the present day. Now, for most of the decades after the Second World War, the main instrument for multilateral cooperation in international trade was the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or as it's sometimes jokingly known, the General Agreement to Talk and Talk. Now, the GATT, founded in 1947, which had its secretariat in Geneva, started with only 23 members, but by the time the GATT ended its course in 1994, it had 110 member governments. Now, what the GATT did was essentially to negotiate reductions in tariffs, in import tariffs, through a succession of so-called trade rounds, the last one being the Uruguay round from the late 1980s to the early 1990s. And the GATT was very successful. Import tariffs were in the order of about close to 50% in the late 1940s. In the industrialized countries, they were down to about 5% or less in the early 1990s. And the GATT's major success was very much in liberalizing trade in industrial products among the well-off countries, the industrialized countries of the West, by reducing import tariffs. In 1995, the World Trade Organization became the successor to the GATT, still headquartered in Geneva. And the WTO has much wider and deeper coverage than the old GATT. The WTO covers not only trade in industrial goods, it also covers trade in agriculture, trade in services, intellectual property rights, trade-related standards, product standards, food safety standards. It covers public procurement and a host of other issues. So, as I said, it's a much wider and deeper organization than the old GATT. It also has a much bigger membership. The membership is 158 today, and that includes China, Russia, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, all of whom have joined in the last 10 to 15 years. And finally, the WTO has a much stronger enforcement mechanism, what's called dispute settlement, than the old GATT. And that's now the strongest arm of international economic law. So in all those respects, the WTO is a much more comprehensive framework for governing international trade than the old GATT. And as a very final point, let me remind you what I think it's all about and why free trade is worth fighting for, non-violently, of course. And that's the free trade trinity. The economic argument about wealth, the political argument about peaceful international relations, and finally that moral argument, free trade very much as part of an expansion of economic freedom. Thank you.
Professor Sally argues that trade works. It enriches societies. For individual people, it expands their access to an ever-growing realm of goods. It also triggers things like peace and liberty. Throughout history, we have had systems to manage international trade and to settle trade disputes, but in the 21st century, we have a more robust system than we have had in any other time in human history. We have a regime, we have WTO for dispute settlement. So one could argue that international trade is a net positive for humanity and it is well managed. Or is it? Is all trade legal trade, for example? Because we know that there is illicit trade around things like drugs, guns, diamonds, the conflict diamonds. But one could even argue that even for those illicit trades, we have made a good faith effort and have some success to show in minimizing their harmful sides. Anyway, this will be your assignment for this week. You will be asked to evaluate international trade. You will be asked to present one positive side of international trade and one negative side, or one side that still needs to be managed well. You will have 500 to 1,000 words to make your case. Those of you taking the course for credits will not be able to advance to week 4 before you turn in your writing assignment. For your reading assignment, you have a chapter from Danny Roderick's The Globalization Paradox, where Professor Roderick is more empathic about the skepticism around international trade. So it will be a nice contrast to Sally's free trade argument, and you'll be exposed to both, and you will have a chance to make up your own mind.